Cormac McCarthy really wasn't the biggest fan of Mr. Samuel Beckett. And in the archive, McCarthy says of Beckett, quote, Beckett's a little too arch and a little too cute for me. I don't think Beckett's serious. And this speaks to Cormac McCarthy's seriousness toward his own work. McCarthy writes like blood is pouring from his hands. And even though a lot of McCarthy's themes and ideas are subverted through his minimalism, his lack of characterization through interiority and other things, he does view his literature as something that can have an impact. Obviously, something like The Road will make you contemplate your life and an apocalyptic reality at length. But I would contend that every single McCarthy novel, if read correctly, opens you up to historical and philosophical pathways that are somewhat endless. That's what this channel is about. Other authors, like, for instance, Haruki Murakami over here, I love Murakami, but there is a somewhat finite end to Murakami's depth. However, it's interesting because that note that McCarthy made about Beckett was actually before The Road. This was earlier in his life. Later in his life, along with other more contemporary novels, while writing The Road, McCarthy references Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot in one of his margins. And much like the analysis we just did on Wittgenstein's Mistress, if you haven't seen that video about Cormac McCarthy and contemporary fiction I just made, go check that out. But in The Road, the father is having certain anxieties that are deeper than just objective reality. He's having contemplations with the meaning of life and the meaning of God and what has happened because he's living in this apocalyptic world. And this is very similar to Beckett's play, maybe I said novel earlier, Waiting for Godot. And even cooler, kind of going deeper, this, McCarthy wanted to be a playwright. He started working on screenplays, and at one point, he almost made a dramatic shift because he was writing books like Suttree and Blood Meridian and getting $2,000 or $3,000 in today's money for the endeavors. And so with Cities of the Plain, No Country for Old Men, Whales and Men, The Stonemason, The Gardener's Son, all the books from that era, or the plays, screenplays, he was trying to make this big pivot. And during the 60s and 70s, Beckett's plays were kind of blowing up when McCarthy was at the peak of his reading and writing career. And an interesting note is that around this time that McCarthy was writing The Road, he was also completing A Sunset Limited, which is very similar to Waiting for Godot. I'm saying that wrong, but whatever. And Lydia Cooper writes about this connection between A Sunset Limited and Beckett, that McCarthy's literal kitchen drama about the core questions of existence and meaning evokes Samuel Beckett's similarly underpopulated stage worlds in which characters trapped in physical stasis argue philosophically through dialogue that plays on the meaningless of disconnected, unproductive language. And another connection that Beckett may have to McCarthy is in his earlier Southern works. So in this earlier Southern works, The Orchard Keeper through Suttree, we see a gradual rise in humor, with Suttree being one of the more humorous books I've ever read, especially for like that era. Like, it still holds up really well. I mean, it still just makes me laugh. And I would probably argue more that it's more of a Twainian influence, but we do know he was reading Beckett at this time, who was very into compassionate black comedy. And I always wonder why Cormac shifted from that. I don't know, when he moved over to El Paso, if he had a shift, if he kind of had this seismic shift after his second divorce and being alone, and I think it was the science, that's really when the science started to pervade his consciousness. And there was this just dramatic shift in Blood Meridian. Even though Blood Meridian has some humorous moments, a couple are still embedded in Blood Meridian. But as we get to the Border trilogy and stuff, it's almost non-existent. There are moments, and the only time we kind of get them again is obviously through some of the screenplays and stuff, because they need to have a little bit of humor. But in The Passenger, which he had been working on in that early era, has a lot of just random funny stuff, and McCarthy making jokes. And and I don't know if that was an interest in Beckett, because some of the jokes, I swear he put them in the last 20 years. Some of them felt very contemporary, but people making wisecracks and stuff have been going on forever. So I'm sure he's had those in his back pocket for his whole career. And it was finally, I can just crack some jokes. So what are your thoughts on Samuel Beckett in general? I've only read one of his plays. Not the biggest fan like McCarthy. I usually like more of a serious crew, but now with our analysis of Berkeley and Beckett, we are starting to tackle the Irish influences of McCarthy, and hopefully soon I'll talk about Cormac McCarthy in Ireland because that is a super fun rabbit hole too. Because that's actually when he started really developing the road.